This is the podcast for week 5. We cover 2 chapters, the bureaucracy and the courts. So let's get started with the questions. The first one is define bureaucracy and identify its role in the political system. Well, the bureaucracy is really the personnel and the agencies responsible for carrying out the public policy that's passed by the legislature. So it's their job, the bureaucracy, it's their job to kind of put flesh and bones on, or flesh on the skeleton of the law. The law itself really kind of is more or less a general idea. For example, you have a welfare law that says that people who are poor should be given assistance by the government. Now, oftentimes, the nature of that assistance is not really spelled out, and who's eligible, who's really poor, and so on. The specifics of that are generally determined by the bureaucracy, not the legislature. In other words, laws are oftentimes not really detailed. Even more so if you look at Supreme Court decisions that tell agencies that they have to do something. Like, for example, when you had the Brown versus Board of Education decision to integrate the schools, it told you that blacks and whites couldn't go to separate schools, but it didn't tell you what integration really meant. Like, in other words, was that 50% black, 50% white, and so on. How you were going to achieve it, how long you had to achieve it. All of those things became decisions made by bureaucrats. So the personnel and the agencies that are responsible for whatever the law is, whether it's a farm bill or the Supreme Court decision dealing with education or the education department or whoever it is, they have to really make it specific. That's another way to put it. So the bureaucracy has to carry out the laws in the sense that it has to really make crucial decisions related to how any law is going to work. The police, for example, they're given. If you look at the laws, there's laws on the books against everything, from gambling to street crime. And it's up to the police, who are in a sense bureaucrats, to decide what laws on the books they're going to enforce. They can't enforce them all. So what we see in terms of law enforcement in general in the United States is that there's a focus on street crime, and these days a focus on terrorists. The FBI spending most of their time on terrorism. Great deal of effort along those lines at the airport, and that means that they are avoiding other kinds of crimes, particularly white-collar crimes. There's almost no emphasis on that at all. There's an emphasis on street crime and an emphasis, like I said, on terrorism, but almost nothing on much else. For example, it's against the law to gamble. Private gambling games are illegal in most jurisdictions, most cities and counties, and yet that's not enforced. Why isn't it enforced? It's not enforced because there's not enough police to do it. So the police get to decide, as bureaucrats, they get to decide which of the laws they're going to enforce and which ones they're going to avoid because they can't enforce them all. So that would be some examples, and that's what makes it political, because those decisions, what laws to enforce, who to decide, who is declared eligible for benefits like welfare, housing, and so on. All of those things become political decisions because they benefit some people and not others. So that pretty much answers it. Number 2, what gives the bureaucracy power? Well, what I just said does. The ability to make political decisions. Also, I listed some other things here. Let me go through them. Little or no supervision. The bureaucracy is um, given power, and unless something goes wrong, there really is no supervision over them. We'll see a legislature calling them into question, usually at budget time, asking them, how much money do you need and where did you spend the money and that kind of thing. But for the most part, unless there's some kind of a scandal, there is no real good supervision on the part of anybody. In other words, nobody's really looking into what the bureaucracy is doing. So that's one of the things that gives them a lot of power. If nobody pays attention to what you're doing, you can do it on your own. You are the master of your own destiny. That's one of the things I really liked about teaching when I was in the classroom, um, is that very little um, supervision was done of you. You got to pick your own books and talk, make out your own lectures and do whatever you wanted, say whatever you wanted. Nobody would criticize you for it. So that's beginning to change, and in some ways, in my day it was different, but that's beginning to change. But supervision, if you don't have supervision, you have power. Number two, legislative expectations. The legislature oftentimes, like I said, or hinted at anyway, was that the legislature passes laws and they're basically general ideas. They tend to be directional, to say something like, we want to participate in the war on terror by questioning people that might be potential terrorists. But they don't really say how you're going to do that. So what's happened is that the bureaucracy's developed this an elaborate procedure, mainly at the airport, for screening people, and little else beyond that in the general population. So the legislature has an idea. They put the idea forward, and then the bureaucracy is expected to carry it out. So that's the legislative expectation, that it's going to be the bureaucracy that'll carry out the wishes of the legislature. And if they don't do it, or they think they're not doing it, they'll call them into question. They'll have committee hearings or something along those lines. But for the most part, there's a legislative expectations that the bureaucracy will really put this together and make it work. Ambiguity about the law. Oftentimes the law doesn't really tell you enough specifics about what's going to happen. So they'll pass a law and they'll say something like for example here in Santa Fe, they just passed a law, state law, not in Santa Fe, but in New Mexico, the state legislature. The legislature is in New Mexico. They were the capital. But anyway, they just passed a law saying that we would collect sales tax on all transactions over the internet. So if you bought something, any citizen of New Mexico that buys something on the internet, they're going to have to pay taxes. At least that's what the law says. But specifically, there's a lot of ambiguity about that, because what does that mean? Does that mean if you buy something from people in China, that the Chinese are going to be required to send a sales tax to New Mexico? No, for the most part, they're talking about domestic companies, and for the most part, they're talking about companies that are doing business in the state of New Mexico, that are really expected to do it, to perform that action. So some a company like Walmart or Target or something like that would be required to really give you the tax because that's the only kinds of people they could really enforce it with. I mean, what could New Mexico do if I decided to buy from a company in China, which is easy to do nowadays? You can buy directly from the Chinese. You don't have to go through American middlemen. And what are they going to do? They can't send somebody from New Mexico to China to enforce the law. So there's a great deal of ambiguity about laws, even though they look like they're very specific. They oftentimes are not. Another thing that gives the bureaucracy power is that loyalty of its members is to the organization or agency that they work for, like the FBI or CIA or state agency, state Department of Agriculture, whatever it is, rather than to the government as a whole or to any particular administration. So a governor or a head of an agency or department may find it difficult when they first come in, if they're new, to get enforcement because, in other words, for the agency or people in the agency to do what they want them to do, because oftentimes they can't fire them. They're civil servants with civil servant jobs, like in the post office or someplace like that, that we would see. And so it's difficult to fire them without some kind of cause, and that means, negligence on the job of some kind. And they tend to be loyal to the agency or department they work for, the post office or, like I said, the FBI or whatever it is, and not to the administration. So that gives the bureaucracy power. For example, I guess a classic example would be President Reagan. When he was president, he vowed to get rid of the Department of Education. He said that was a weak department at the national level. Education is primarily, as you probably already know, handled mainly by state and local government, and he argued it wasn't necessary at the national level. So he's going to get rid of them, and they're relatively small. This is not the Pentagon. It's a relatively small department. He couldn't do it. Make a long story short, he was there for 8 years. He couldn't do it. Why? Mainly because personnel working for the Department of Education sought help from the legislature. They sought help from interest groups and so on because their members were loyal to the agency, not to the president. And you see that at the state level all the time. You see that even at the local level. And then the last thing is perceived professionalism. And what I mean by that is that bureaucrats are identified as professional people, that they know what they're doing, they're experts in their area, and that gives them power because anybody who's perceived as an expert is then identified as somebody who knows what they're doing and generally knows more than other people do. And so when they testify before state agencies or local city council or whatever it is, their opinions tend to have higher weight because they're experts. It's like going to court. If somebody's identified as an expert, their opinion has higher weight than the average person. So all of those things give the bureaucracy power because the bureaucracy tends to be perceived as professionals and all the rest. Number 3 is, how do the courts differ from the political branches? For one thing, they're ignored by the public. The public tends to pay more attention, especially to executives like the president, the governor, and the mayor. They pay the most attention to them, some attention to the legislature as well. But the courts tend to go on their business without the public paying any attention to it at all. You can see that by the media. So if you watch television news or you read a newspaper, you'll see that there's going to be way more information in there about, first of all, about executives, presidents, governors, mayors, and then something about the legislature if they're in session, but little or nothing about the courts. The courts almost never get any publicity whatsoever, and therefore the public ignores them. So the public only really knows what it sees on television or hears or reads about, and so the end result is there's a tendency to ignore everything else. It's like the bureaucracy as well. The bureaucracy is not covered in the news unless there's some kind of scandal, and so the public doesn't lives in ignorance about what they're doing. Number two is they're considered less political. The courts are not considered to be political branches. Just the legislature and the executive are considered to be political, and the courts are considered non-political. That is, judges are supposedly making decisions based on the facts of the case, the credibility of the litigants, and so on, not to do with politics. Nothing really to do with politics. And oftentimes they're elected on a nonpartisan ballot. They tend to present themselves as non-political and be perceived that way. So the public thinks of them as much less political than you would of a mayor or governor, or be able to identify them as a Democrat or Republican, whereas most judges are much harder to be seen that way. Okay, number three is that they campaign differently, often on a nonpartisan basis. So the campaigns are very different. If you look at a campaign for governor or a campaign for mayor, that's going to be very different than a campaign for judge. Most of the time, judges don't campaign in the same sense at all. You don't usually see most judges on television or even taking out ads in newspapers or any of the kind of things that you typically see executives and legislative candidates using. Even things like appearing in forums where they debate the issues or talk about why they should get elected. You usually see the legislative candidates and the executive candidates doing that, but not the judicial candidates. So it's a totally different kind of campaigning. And in most places in the United States, it's nonpartisan. That is, just the candidate for judge name appears on the ballot, not whether they're a Democrat or Republican. Different public expectations. We expect judges, for example, to be lawyers. We expect them to have gone to law school, to have gone to prestigious law schools. In cases in places where you have appeals judges, you expect them to have experience on lower courts before they go to a court of appeals. So the public expectation is for more professionalism, more of a academic background, more experience, all of that, than you would of the political people. It's not, these days, it's not even unheard of for candidates who have no background in politics to run for political office like President of the United States. That's a new phenomenon. But back in the day, say when I was a kid, it wasn't like that. You had to work your way up through the system in order to become, say, a presidential candidate. And today, mainly because of alienation and cynicism, there's a kind of disregard for politics and politicians, and so it's to some degree it's advantageous or an advantage to be non-political or not to have experience. Seems crazy to me, but that's just where we're at in the 21st century these days. I mentioned this already. You need qualifications to run. You can't run for a judgeship unless you're at least a lawyer and preferably have some judicial experience. And then the last thing is that judges are rated by their peers. There's lawyers organizations like the Bar Association and so on that rate the candidates running for office. And so most of the people involved, probably all the people that are, say, in a bar association, whether that's a state bar association or the American Bar Association or whatever it is, are probably all lawyers. And they get to vote on who they think ought to be judges. And so, in a sense, that's uh, a judgment by your peers. The last one is what are the effects of having so many lawyers? We have a couple million lawyers in the United States, and it really does affect the society as a whole. Um, there's quite a few things. I listed some things here. There's legalese in almost all paperwork. In other words, if you get a contract of any kind, you buy a cell phone and you get a cell phone contract, more than likely you can't read it. It's written in legalese. It's written in a way, first of all, written by lawyers and written so that only lawyers can understand it. And I see this with everything. Something could be very simple, like you could have buy a house, buy a car, buy a cell phone, buy anything, and the contract that you sign or the legal papers that you sign um, are almost always uh, un, um, unreadable to the average public. And keep in mind that I say this. I mean, I experience this all the time, and I have a PhD, so I'm not like the typical citizen who maybe went to high school or went to some college. I think that's where we're at now, like 2 years of college for the average citizen in the United States. So, you know, I can't understand it. I can't read it. Um, I'm sure most other people can't. Just look at your tax forms. Tax forms that are written by lawyers, it's really hard to read them if you do your own taxes. I do mine, and that's a difficulty. So anywhere you go, you see the influence of lawyers with this legalese stuff where it could be very simple. They could just simply write down what they mean, write down what you want. You could make an agreement without a lawyer. You don't need lawyers for every transaction that you have, but unfortunately, that's what we're getting to in this society. I know one of the things that was very refreshing to me when I came to New Mexico and I bought a house. When I bought my house here, I saw that when you close on your house and you sign the contracts for the buyer and the seller, you didn't have lawyers. You didn't have to have lawyers. You just had a realtor. So each side had a realtor, and they took care of it. And it works out fine. It works out fine without lawyers. But, you'd never do that in Illinois. Okay, another thing is that lawyers um, are in business, not just practicing law. So that's what I'm saying when I say you get anytime you buy something, you see this contract that you have to sign, which is written by a lawyer. Why? Because the lawyer works for whatever place you bought you got a contract with, like whether that's Comcast or you bought something at Target or you bought something at Walmart. There are lawyers working for Walmart and Target and Comcast and every other place in the United States, and they're writing up these contracts so you can't understand them. So it isn't just we see lawyers when we need a lawyer or we want to contact a law office somewhere, or you see signs for law offices or practicing lawyers. There are lawyers in all businesses. Um, there's a whole slew of lawyers that work for, say, somebody like McDonald's, a big corporation that's across the whole United States. I mention that because their headquarters is in Chicago, so you guys could see that. If you see the McDonald's building, half of the people there, they're not dishing out hamburgers. They're taking care of legal business for McDonald's. Another thing is there's so much litigation. Lawyers have to find business. Those practicing in law firms and so on have to find business. And so what they do is they dream up cases. And in the United States, it's easy to do, to have kind of like crazy cases and unusual cases because you don't need, there aren't strict standards for standing. That is the right to bring a case. You don't need, you don't really need any kind of legitimate standing. In other countries, like if you went to England, you couldn't get away with the kinds of cases that you have here because the judge would just throw it out, saying, basically you don't have standing, you can't bring a case. It doesn't make any sense. And I'll give you an example. I saw this in a newspaper the other day here as a typical example of the kind of nonsense that brings about court cases in the United States. They're closing a school here. It's a college. There's quite a few of them. There's quite a few schools here for the arts. This is an artsy place. There's a lot of artists here, mainly probably because they don't have other forms of employment. But there's a college, it's called the Santa Fe College of Art and Design. And it's over here on St. Michael's. Anyway, you don't need to know that. But it's closing. And it's closing because the people who own it, it's it's a for-profit college, which we see a lot of nowadays. It isn't like Lewis. This is a for-profit place. In other words, it's owned by a corporation. This one is owned by the Laurel Educational Inc. And so anyway, they decided to go out of business. And so they're closing. At the end of this year, they're going to close. And so in the paper, I see here, I saved this so I could talk about it now with you guys. I see here that there's a suit. A number of students who go to the school are suing the school for closing. So they say they're going to close in 2018. And so anyway, they're being sued. And here's what the Santa Fe attorney says. This is the guy representing these students who are bringing a class action lawsuit against the place because they're closing. So another, I mean, to me, this is the stupidest thing I've heard, but let me tell you what he said. His name is Ben Allison, and he says, who's representing the students, he says, this closing can affect their earning potential for the rest of their lives. So the fact that the school is closing is going to affect these students in terms of their earning potential for the rest of their life. There's a lot of stress and emotional harm, I'm quoting here, there's a lot of stress and emotional harm that happens from this kind of disruption. So he's suing them on two grounds. What he's saying here, and I won't, quote any more of the paper, but what he's saying here is he's going after the organization or the corporation on two grounds. One is that these students are losing their earning potential. The money that they would have made from art and design is now lost to them because the school closed. And the second thing is he's suing them for emotional damage because they suffered psychologically when this place closed, because they're going through a trauma because of the school closing. They had committed to come to the school, and now the place isn't fulfilling their 4 years of education. Well, this is the typical kind of nonsense that we get in the legal system today. If this was England, they would have thrown that out in 10 seconds. But here, it'll be a court case, and it'll probably go on for years. First of all, students are not limited to go to one school. If a school closes, they can go somewhere else. We have at least two other places, two other colleges that are arts and design schools here. It's like a dime a dozen around here. So, I mean, if one closes, you can just go to another one. It's not like it's the only school. And everybody experiences some kind of trauma every time some negative things happens to them. Who do you sue? I mean, why do you sue? It's just, I mean, to me, it's laughable. The whole thing is laughable. But there's so much litigation. And because there's so much litigation, and everybody's afraid of litigation, it leads to our next one, which is defensive practices in business and medicine. Everywhere you go, everybody is afraid that they're going to get sued. Everybody in business. So that's every professional, like if you go to a doctor or any business that you go to, they're afraid that they're going to get sued. So they practice defensively. Medicine is practiced defensively. That's one of the reasons why it's so expensive. I remember one time, this is when I was in Chicago. I went into the doctor. I was having a problem with pain. I had pain in my side. It was on the same side as my what am I thinking of? It was where my appendix is. That's what I was thinking of. It was where my appendix is. And anyway, so I go in the doctor. I tell him I had this pain. He kind of checks me out, doesn't see anything. He said, okay, I'm going to send you for an MRI. So I go for an MRI, and I get this MRI, and they start at the top of my head, and they start giving me a full body MRI. And I told them, I said, no, that's not. What are you doing? I said, I'm here because I'm trying to get a MRI on my hip. That's all I need. I just need a hip MRI. And they said, no, it doesn't say that here. So they gave me a full body thing. I think it cost, I don't remember now because this was a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure it cost at least $6,000. It probably should have cost less than $1,000, but it cost $6,000, and nobody said anything but me about it. I mean, I was complaining because I don't want to put up with all that nonsense. But the insurance paid it, and we go through all this stuff, and that's the kind of thing, they weren't going to call up the doctor. They weren't going to trust me and just do an MRI on my hip because they were afraid that I'd come back later with maybe a pain in my head or something and say it's the hospital's fault because the MRI didn't show it and they didn't take the right MRI, blah, 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 blah. So, this is the kind of thing that happens. Doctors, for example, back in the day when I was a kid, doctors would examine you and then make a diagnosis of what was wrong with you. Oh, you got the flu, you got this, you got that, whatever it was. Today, they don't do that. You go in an office, they look at you, they smile, and you say you got this pain and that pain, and they immediately send you for a test. You're either going to take blood tests or you're going to take an MRI or a CT scan or an X-ray or something. They're not going to just diagnose you. Why? Because they're practicing defensive medicine. They're afraid they'll make a mistake if they just examine you and tell you what's wrong. And as a result, it's way, way, way more expensive to do it the way they're doing now. And that's all because of lawyers. They're afraid they're going to get sued. And you could do the same thing. You can analyze the same thing with businesses. They're all afraid they're going to get sued too. So they have all kinds of things on there. Like, for example, you buy a ticket, you want to go to a ball game. A lot of you are probably excited because the Cubs won. You buy a ticket to a Cubs game. On the back of it, it'll have all this legalese about how they're not responsible if something happens to you when you're at the game. All of which is defensive on their part. It's not true, by the way, but anyway, it's all done, and every business does this kind of thing, disclaiming any liability in case something happens. And again, that's all happened because we have so many lawyers. Then the last thing is the public expectation of judicial solutions. to everyday problems. People just want legal solutions, and that's very expensive. That's also generated by lawyers who are, lawyers are often called ambulance chasers, and that's because literally that's kind of what they do, especially in Chicago. You get in a car accident, oftentimes you'll see a lawyer there passing out cards. Um, yeah, it's just there are a lot of disputes you can have. You can have disputes with your neighbor and so on. All you got to do is watch something like Judge Judy or any of those small claims court type programs. Small claims, something that's minor, under $1,000, some places a couple thousand, whatever way these misdemeanor kinds of claims or small claims are defined. But essentially, if you look at those television shows, you watch something like Judge Judy, you watch that television show, what that says to you, or what it says to me anyway, is that these are almost all things that could be handled privately. You don't need to go to court for this kind of nonsense, minor things like this. This is done just because we are a judicial society. We're a litigation society, litigious society, whatever terminology you want to use. So that we expect that if something goes wrong, we have a business, some business does something for us. Somebody comes in and puts in a furnace in your house, or you take your suit coat to a cleaner's or whatever, and the results are not what you wanted or what you expected. There's always this anticipation of judicial action. I'm going to sue that person. It's an American phenomena that's brought about largely because we have so many lawyers. Okay, I think I probably said enough about all this.